You're listening to Brandon Sports Talk, interviewing professional athletes and Paralympians and Olympians. And now for your professional athlete interview and your host, Brandon P.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the USA track and field high jump Olympian and Hall of Famer Dwight Stone. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to get started in competing in the sport of track and field?
Well, my real passion when I was a kid was baseball. I wanted to be a professional baseball player. And one Sunday afternoon, I was looking for some friends to play with in July, and they all seemed to be out of town, either because they were at grandma's house or they're at camp or whatever it might be. But not one of my friends was around. So I couldn't play catch or pickle or over the line or anything else. So I'm looking for a Dodger game on the television set, and I come across ABC's Wide World of Sports, and they're covering the U.S.-Russian track and field meet in Moscow in 1963. And an individual is standing there looking at crossbar and standards in a sawdust pit. There's nobody running around the track. And he takes a couple walking steps, couple jogging steps, 3 quick running steps, and jumps over this bar at a world record height of 7'5 3/4", and the crowd goes nuts. 100,000 people go nuts. And I noticed no one was helping him at all. No teammates, nobody giving a ball or setting a block. And I said, wow, that's impressive. I got to do that. So my dad was a contractor and my mom had a licensed childcare business. So I gathered together some cinder blocks and some bricks and some wood and some nails. And my buddy down the street, who was not home, I knew had a bamboo bar. I don't know why, but he did. And I knew where it was. So I jumped the fence. I grabbed his bamboo pole, and I started high jumping in my front yard at 9.5 years old for my own enjoyment. And once I got a chance to actually compete with it, once I was in middle school, I just continued to excel and improve. And I had it in my head that I was going to make the 1972 Olympic team after I had watched the 1968 Olympics on TV when I was 14. And 4 years later, I was the youngest male Olympian on the U.S. team.
Of course, what was that experience like going to UCLA and getting to compete in college?
Well, I really shouldn't have ended up at UCLA. USC is where I always thought I would go. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the band leader for the USC Trojan band that marched into the Olympic Games in 1932. But USC did not recruit me, and UCLA did. I wanted to stay close to home because of weather, because of family, and UCLA was the best track and field team in the country. So the idea of being a part of a national championship team really did appeal to me. And my freshman year, which was the Olympic year, my goal was to make the Olympic team. So I wasn't paying much attention to school, which was not unusual for me. I was not a particularly good student. And I reached my goal. I made the Olympic team. And I never returned to the university because I wanted to redshirt for a year so I would be a senior in the next Olympic year. And coach wanted to win the national championship the next year, felt I needed to be on the team to do it. They won without me. So I ended up wandering around for a couple of years and ended up at Long Beach State and made the Olympic team when I was a senior at Long Beach State.
What was that experience like for you to compete for the first Olympics as a freshman?
Well, it had been a goal of mine for almost 4 years, which when you're 14, that's a long time. And my idol and birthday brother, Ronaldo Brown of Compton, had made the Olympic team as a 17-year-old in 1968 and finished 5th. So I knew it could be done. And thankfully, I happened to go to the right high school. My high school coach was a 1952 Olympian in the 800 meters and always knew he would be a coach. So he picked the brain of all the world-class athletes that he was around. And we figured the Fosbury flop technique out together and adapted it to me, to my strengths and weaknesses. And I just thought it was a fait accompli. I just didn't see any reason why I shouldn't be able to improve enough to make that team. And I won the Olympic trials that year. And in the ensuing 4 years, I set the world record a total of 9 times, and was lucky enough to win a bronze medal. In the first Olympics, I set the world record after that. At that point, I just said, listen, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't be able to dominate this event. My technique is good. I'm working hard. I'm working smart. And I have the advantage of having already been on an Olympic team at 18 years old. I've been to the top of the mountain. There's nothing that I can experience that's more nerve-wracking or has more attention on it than that. So it really did set me on a great path. I mean, I set a high school national record when I was 17. I made an Olympic team when I was 18. I set a world record when I was 19. So I had an incredible amount of early success in my career.
Of course, at the age of 18, what was that experience like being one of the youngest persons to be on the Olympic team at that time?
The previous Olympic team, 68, had 2 high school kids on it, Ronaldo Brown, as I mentioned, and then Casey Kerrigan in the pole vault. So it wasn't terribly unusual. But this particular year, 72, we had no high school kids on the team. I was the youngest. I was a freshman in college. I was a young freshman, but I was a freshman in college. The women had a lot more high school and younger athletes on their team. But the men and women didn't really mix at the collegiate level yet. It was another decade until that happened. So I felt it was a national progression, to be quite honest. I'm an Olympic athlete for a coach, and he was encouraging me. And I felt I was doing all the things I needed to do. So once you get to that level, you've gone through all the steps. I mean, one of my favorite authors is Malcolm Gladwell. And he talks about 10,000 hours of doing something to become expert at it. And when I went back and looked at how much time I had spent doing my craft, that was about the amount of time I had spent when I thought about all the training I had done and all the preparation, all the study. So it made perfect sense. Everything that I was doing made sense. So I was encouraged that I should be able to continue improving, which I did all the way up to the time I was age 30. I had my personal best jump at age 30.
Of course, in 84, what was that experience like competing for the U.S. trials and placing first to then make it to the Olympics?
Well, as I mentioned, I was 30 that year. The trials and the games were going to be in Los Angeles. And the track and field community, from a historical perspective, said, well, this guy's washed up. He's going to be 30 years old, and he hasn't improved his personal best in 8 years. You know, he's really not a factor in the run-up to these Olympics. And I knew better. I knew how well I was training. I knew how well I was executing my technique. I knew how to periodize my training at that point for over a decade. So I bided my time. I was patient. I already had a child. I was married, and was very methodical about the way I prepared. And I went out there. I won the trials. I set the American record. I jumped my personal best for the first time in 8 years. I was working for ABC television at the time, which restricted how much training I could do. So it stopped me from overtraining. And I was jumping in front of a hometown crowd. So, and I was the first high jumper to make 3 Olympic teams. Only 2 of us have done it, myself and Charles Austin, the 1996 Olympic champion. So it was pretty rarefied air. And I think I also opened the door to a lot of athletes in my event, maybe many others, that may have felt that they were done and washed up by the time they were in their mid-20s. And what changed in track and field is, by becoming a professional sport, it wasn't really officially professional at that point, but almost. They no longer had to look at it as, okay, I'm out of college. I've got 2 more years to the Olympics. I can ham and egg it and make it work. And if I make the Olympic team, great, then I'll retire. That was no longer something they had to do. So I think there was very little exploration about how old an athlete could be in a particular event and still excel and still improve. And I like to think that I help open that door and be an example to a lot of athletes that, hey, Dwight Stone's improved his personal best at age 30, made an Olympic team and got 4th at the Olympics. I'm 24. You know, there's no reason why I can't go to another Olympics if I didn't make this team. I didn't make the 80 team, which didn't go anywhere. But I would have liked to, just from a standpoint of my resume, then I would have been a 4-time Olympian. But I like to say that I only make Olympic teams where we actually go.
Of course, what was that feeling like the first time you made the Olympics versus the last time you made the Olympic team?
They were, Brandon, I will tell you, they were almost identical feelings, and I'll tell you why. Again, when you're 14, 4 years is a long time. And then I realized that dream in Eugene, Oregon. I was so confident in that competition. I remember calling my coach after the qualifying, and I said, not only am I going to make this team, I'm going to win this meet. And I did so. We all jumped 7.3. It was a world record for my age at the time and a lifetime best and a UCLA school record. We all made the team by jumping 7.1 3/4. The field was, I know, hypnotized in a negative way. The world record holder didn't make the team. Ronaldo Brown, who had made the Olympic team 4 years later, did not make the team. He did not have a good day. And basically 3 unknowns made that team. But there was no doubt in my mind as I warmed up and prepared. It was a beautiful day. I was familiar with the facility. And I had maybe one of the best times being in a competition that I can ever remember. No different 12 years later in Los Angeles. I was so supremely well prepared. I had great support from the crowd. I had jumped well the year before to meet there and won it at the Coliseum. So I had every reason to believe that I would make the team and set the American record. In fact, on television 2 days earlier, when I was interviewed and introduced as one of the analysts, I was asked, "What do you think about your own prospects?" by Al Michaels. And I said, "I'm in American record shape. If I'm a betting man, I bet on Dwight Stones." And he laughed a little bit. And 2 days later, what I'd said would happen came true. So I had a great time at the 84 trials. There were no nerves at all for me. For my wife, completely different situation. I was renegotiating an extension of my shoe contract, and pretty much everything hinged on that meet. And had I not made the Olympic team, that would have been the end of my shoe contract and probably the end of my career. As a result of making that team in a spectacular fashion, setting the American record, I was fortunate enough and had worked for Sports Illustrated that week with some of their clients. They put me on the cover of the magazine that week, and that was a wonderful negotiating tool for me with my shoe company.
What was that feeling like getting to set those records, and do you still hold some of the records that you've set so far?
Well, the only record that I hold that I know of, aside from individual meet records or stadium records that I don't even remember, is that I still hold the Cal State Long Beach school record at 7.7 1/4, which I believe I probably will always hold, because anybody who's jumping that well as a collegian will probably be offered some incentives by a shoe company to leave school and compete professionally. So I'm pretty confident that after now, what has it been? 1976 is when I set that record. So it's coming up 50 years here in a few years. I'm pretty sure I'll always hold that record. But as far as national records or anything like that, no, those are long gone, and I'm quickly moving out of the top 10 jumps ever jumped in this country, which is fine. That shows the progression of the event, an event that I, of course, love. And hopefully my legacy will be that I stimulated a lot of interest in the event and brought a lot of athletes that might have done something else. They decided to concentrate on the high jump and excelled at it. I hope that's part of my legacy.
What was that feeling like getting to set those high jump records and now seeing them being broken by these up and coming high jumpers?
Well, setting that, of course, was great because, ours is an event that you can choose what you want to try and perform. The high jump and the pole vault are the two events in the sport where you can set the bar at the mark that you want to clear. The throws and the long jump and triple jump, you hit one, a good one in the first round or the sixth round, and the rest of your jumps or throws can be terrible. But if you have that one really good effort, it can be the winner, it can be the gold medal, it can be the world championship, it can be the world record. In the high jump and pole vault, you have to be very incremental about your effort. So it's a tremendous amount of discipline and a desire not to overperform at a particular height for fear of taking away what you need at the high height. So setting those benchmarks and having those as goals and the things you have to do on the track and in the weight room and with drills and everything else in order to achieve those goals, when you actually do it, it's a culmination of so many different elements and factors and coaches and day in, day out boring training. You might wonder why we never have a reality show about athletes training for their sport. It's because it would be terribly boring. It would be like having a reality show about grass growing or paint drying. So we do that arduous work pretty much in anonymity, and it's not much fun, but the performing is fun, and it's fun way beyond the drudgery of training, at least for me. The kids I coach, I tell them that. I said, listen, I'm not gonna try and kid you. Training for any event, anything to where you're gonna really excel and be great, is not enjoyable. It's not fun. If the performing of your event or your sport is not more fun than the training for it, then you need to find something else to do, because otherwise you just won't show up every day. And if you don't show up every day, you're going to lose to somebody who does show up every day. So that's the way I approached it. And when I would, set a world record, though I got a little jaded about it, to be honest, it's something that you look at and say, no one in the history of mankind has ever done this before. There's a certain feeling about that that's hard to describe. But as I said, especially indoors, I got a little jaded. I set 7 indoor records, and it became a little bit mundane, to be honest.
What does it mean to you to be an Olympian and have OLY behind your last name?
Well, that was always my goal when I was a kid. When I watched the Mexico City Games and realized at that point that was the zenith for track and field, that there was no professional sport, that if you were an Olympian, that's something very, very special that stays with you for the rest of your life. And I had been reading books and been inspired by many different Olympians, amongst them Rayford Johnson and Bob Mathias and Jim Ryan and Randy Matz, all these great athletes from the 60s. And to be in that same category with them, being an Olympian and being a multiple Olympian, and meeting those guys and getting to know them and being a peer of theirs, was one of the great joys of my career. And unfortunately, now seeing some of them pass, Dick Fosbury just passing here earlier this spring. We just had a nice send-off for him here in LA last week. It's a little bittersweet, knowing how much of an influence they had on me, certainly, and I'm certain other athletes as well. When you get to be my age, I'll be 70 in December. It becomes about legacy. What did you leave behind? Did you leave behind things that are positive, negative? How did you influence your event, your sport, other people? And as I've traveled around and continued to do television sports, I'm buoyed by the fact that a lot of athletes have come up to me and said, you're the reason why I started high jumping. I loved watching you on TV. I love the way that you enjoyed the competition and the antics that you went through. And it really was something that attracted me to the sport. These athletes that have decided to use performance enhancing drugs or do something that they really shouldn't do and brings disrepute on the sport, maybe themselves. I try to tell them, think about your legacy. Think about the questions your kids are going to ask you or your grandkids are going to ask you when they read about the things that you did. When you're trying to impress upon them that you've got to do things with honesty and integrity and not cheat and everything else, how are you going to answer that question when your child asks you? Because they will. And so I've always been very, very aware of what I leave behind. And I haven't always done it exactly right, but I've always thought in my head, think about what you're doing here and how this will look later. And I've got 2 grandkids, and I want them to be able to be proud of their grandfather when he's gone.
Of course, looking back on your legacy as a track and field athlete, what are some of your fondest memories?
I think just the competition and the satisfaction that the work I put in and the choices I made about when to peak properly, when to be at my best. It's very, very few times that I can think of where I didn't jump or perform what I felt I should perform, especially when something important was on the line, whether it was to make a team or be at the Olympics, be at the World Championships. I almost always jumped my best marks of the season when it mattered most. And I try to pass it along to the kids that I coach. I said, it isn't just about jumping high. Jumping high is great and important because it's validation of the work that you've done and your ability. But it's jumping high at the right time. When you get to the postseason, it's single elimination every week. If you have a bad day and you're outside of the qualification, your season ends. So jumping high early in the spring, okay, that's great, and it should validate that you're doing the right thing and you're training properly. But when it gets to the postseason, or you've got to make a team, or you've got to get to next week, you've got to bring the right performance at the right time. And I try to impress that upon them, that we're trying to peak at the state meet or CIF finals or whatever it might be. And to jump high in March or April, okay, that's great, but you may sacrifice jumping high in May and June when it really matters. And I always looked at that and said, okay, I'm looking at the season. Where do I want to peak? Where are the best jumpers in the world going to be? At what meet will I have to bring my best game? And some of the meets in between, I'm not going to jump so well because I'm going to have to train through those meets. And people who probably have no business beating me are going to beat me because I'm not going to be in the shape I want to be in to jump high to beat them. But when it comes down to a national championship or an Olympic trials or world championship trials or an Olympic games, I'm going to be ready. You better bring your A game because I'm going to bring mine. So I think that's the lessons I certainly learned. And I learned that from my coach, who was an Olympian. He knew the same thing. You got to periodize your training and you've got to be patient. You got to have a good grasp on delayed gratification. You may want to jump high or run fast or throw far at a particular time, but you've got to be disciplined about when it's important. And I think that's one of the most important things that I've learned and I can pass along.
What was that transition like for you from going from competing at the biggest stage to after retirement and getting into color commentating?
I was very fortunate, Brandon, because I was hired back in 1977 when I was 23 years old, pretty much sight unseen, on the recommendation of someone who CBS had called and said, hey, we're looking for some new people to freshen up our broadcast. I frankly thought the broadcast needed no freshening up. They had Adrian Metcalf and Bill Toomey on the broadcast for CBS, names that probably some of your listeners might know, but maybe most don't. Adrian Metcalf was a very good British athlete in track and field back in the day, had a beautiful voice and was an extremely good play-by-play announcer. And Bill Toomey was the 1968 Olympic decathlon champ. So he knew a lot about all of the events because he did them. But be that as it may, I was 23. This friend of mine recommended me, and I got called and I got interviewed on the phone. And less than 2 weeks later, I was doing my very first event, the LA Times indoor meet here in February 1977, an event that they did not know I was also competing in, which was a big surprise to the producer. And frankly, he was not that happy about it because it was a Thursday night production meeting and the meet was Friday night. It's too late to replace me. But we figured it out and I competed. I won. I jumped well. And that was my debut. I did another event for them later in the season at the national championships, which I also won. And I think because of the gimmick of me competing in and broadcasting the same events, that's what allowed me the room to learn the craft a little bit, learn how television works. And they loved the fact that I was also competing in the same event. And over the years, I was able to do more events and learn the craft better. And by the time I retired in 1988, I'd already been working in television for 11 years. So it was a very, very smooth and natural transition for me to then become a color commentator as full-time as you can be as a track and field analyst. And then by the time we got to 1990, I started doing play-by-play, which I enjoy very, very much. I liked being an analyst, but I'm quite a ways away from the sport as an athlete now. There's nobody competing now, certainly that was competing when I was. In fact, there are very few people that are competing now that were born when I retired. So being a play-by-play announcer for me is much more satisfying. I enjoy calling races. I enjoy inserting those comments that I might have that my analysts are not recognizing, or a historical reference that they may not know that I can slip in. And I cover the best collegiate conference in the country, the SEC. They always have 5 or 6 teams in the top 10, both men's and women's. I get to see the future stars of our Olympic teams and our world championship teams up close and get to know them quite well. So, and I cover the NCAA indoor and outdoor championships. So I get the best meets of the year collegiately. And I love being a collegiate athlete. I loved it. I love track and field at the high school and college level because it's a team sport at that level. After you leave college, it's no longer a team sport. It really is an individual sport. And you may get together and be on an Olympic team or a world championship team, but there's no team score being kept. And I really loved that aspect of my sport when I was in high school and in college.
Of course, when you got started in the broadcasting, what was that like balancing being an athlete, a professional athlete, and a broadcaster?
For me, it was kind of easy, Brandon, and I'll tell you why. Because I am so interested in sport, I'm a big track and field fan. It's still my favorite sport. And on the Pacific Coast Club, we had a lot of great athletes in every event. So I picked their brains almost like I was going to coach the event. And I oftentimes did. I did a lot of coaching of the vaulters we had on our team because they didn't feel intimidated, or intimidated may be the wrong word. They didn't feel like they were giving away anything, any trade secret by telling me, as opposed to another vaulter. So I would have vaulters come over to me and say, "Did you see my last clearance?" I'd say, "Yeah." He said, "Do you think I should move up a pole?" And I would go, "Yeah, move up a pole if you're going to execute the technique correctly. But if you're not going to stick your right hand in the air like you should and go for it 100%, stay on the same pole." So they appreciated the fact that number one, I was watching, and number two, that I had enough knowledge to help them make a decision. So I would take lap splits for milers and distance runners, et cetera. So I was really into it. I loved my sport. And I also hated hanging around the high jump apron for 2.5 and 3.5 hours, because it's like watching paint dry. And a lot of the guys in the event were, monosyllabic, and I just didn't want to hang with them. So I would leave, which would also be a little intimidating to my competition, because they couldn't figure out how it is that I could leave when they needed to be there the entire time and focus for the entire time. If you got to focus for 3 or 3.5 hours, play golf, which I love, but you got to concentrate the entire time if you want to be good. I didn't feel like I needed to concentrate the entire time. So in TV, I could leave my sport, leave my event, go do whatever I needed to do for television, whether it be an interview or voice over something. And it was a nice respite for me from my mental health. I mean, I get to talk about somebody else's performance, analyze it, pick it apart. If I felt that there was a need for them to do something to improve. I've always said to a lot of kids, I want you to coach me in the long jump. I said, I'm not a long jump coach. I can analyze the long jump. I can tell you why this guy is jumping better than this guy, but I can't take you as a talent and train you up to become a better long jumper. I don't have that skill set. What I have is Mike Powell's phone number. That's the skill set I have. I can hand you off to someone who's really good at coaching the event. So, but I can analyze every event, especially the field events. That was my beat with NBC for 35 years. And I would interview the best athletes. I would sit down with them for a drink or dinner and say, "Okay, talk to me about this technique change that I've noticed you've made." And they'd look at me and go, "What did you notice?" And I'd tell them. They said, "Wow, you really do know what you're talking about." I said, "Yeah, it's my job to know what I'm talking about. So now I want to know what it is you did, why you did it, and how long did it take for you to perfect it?" Because when I changed my run up from the 72 Olympics to the 73 season, it took me 3 months to effect that change. And I had to do it very deliberately. And I knew what I was doing. And still, I had a tough time with the transition from the semicircle approach to the J approach. And I finally got it down, got it right just before the indoor season. And I had a spectacular 1973 as a result. But sometimes you got to take a step backwards to take a couple steps forward, which just nets you one step forward. So I knew that about myself and my technical event, and I just assumed it was part of every technical event. And it turns out I was right. So when I would notice something was different and something had changed, I would go to that athlete and say, "Okay, talk to me about this," because I want to be able to convey it. I want to be able to educate the audience. I want that kid, that 15 or 16-year-old kid who's a little bit turned on to this sport, maybe that your event, to understand how your event works and thereby maybe help them improve. And I felt that was my job in television, to educate and entertain and inform at the same time. And I like to think that in my 46th year of doing it, I accomplished that goal.
What was that experience like as a color analyst in the 2008 Summer Olympics?
Well, at that point, that was about my 11th Olympic Games that I'd been involved in, between being an athlete and being a commentator. And I did both at the '84 Olympics, by the way. The only athlete to have 2 credentials, which now they've managed to make it so that's impossible, but it wasn't impossible then. Beijing was a great games and a great track meet. I always look at it from a standpoint of the track meet. I don't start working until the second week of the Olympics, so I enjoy myself the first week with my wife. We go and see events outside of track and field. We go to swimming and gymnastics and whatever else we can get tickets to, because it's the Olympics. It's an experience. It's something unique. But by the time it's time for me to work, I'm up very early in the morning watching the qualifying rounds, and I'm out very, very late at night doing the voiceovers of the events from that day, especially if an Olympics is as far away as Beijing with a completely different time zone. So it's arduous work, but I loved it because I'm watching the best track meet in the world that year. I'm watching, 42 events of the best people there are on earth going for the most coveted prize that there is. So to me, it's a wonderful opportunity to just watch a great track meet and bank some more amazing memories. To watch Usain Bolt have the year that he had and go on to be the dominant force that he was in sprinting for the next 12 years after that was a privilege to watch that as up close and personal. And to watch that high jump competition was very, very satisfying. The American team did not have a great field events performance in those games on the men's side. In fact, it was abysmal. Only had 4 finalists in the entire field competition, and 3 of them were shot putters. No high jumpers, no long jumpers, no triple jumpers, 1 pole vaulter. It really, really was a low point for American field, and they did a nice job coming back 4 years later. But those are my memories from those games. The last one I did for NBC was 2012 for London, and then I did ESPN International's coverage for the Caribbean of the Rio Games in 2016. Because of COVID, almost no commentators were able to be in Tokyo for the Olympic Games, and all the other countries did them from their own country. And I'm hoping that I might be able to catch on with someone to cover the games in Paris in 2024. I'm still holding out hope that could happen.
What was that feeling like for you to be inducted into the U.S. Track and Field Hall of Fame in '98?
Well, I think that's sort of the cherry on the sundae, Brandon. Again, it's legacy, right? What did you leave behind? And sometimes it's a little bit more than just marks or, performances. I made 3 Olympic teams. I won 2 medals. I set 10 world records. I was probably a pretty obvious candidate for the Hall of Fame. And I got in 10 years after my retirement. And to be honest, a lot of people came up to me and said, I thought you were already in the Hall of Fame. I ran the risk of not getting nominated because a lot of people felt that I was already in there. So it was I think a nice bookend from a standpoint of my athletic career. But even at that point, my hope, and still is my hope, is that people recognize me as much for my television work as they did or do for my athletic career. I'm very proud of my television work, and there was an 11-year overlap there. But I've been doing television commentary for much longer than I was an active athlete. So in the final analysis, if I start to get nominated and eligible to get into some halls of fame or other recognition or lifetime achievement, et cetera, from a broadcast point of view, that would also be extremely satisfying. To reach that pinnacle in 2 areas, that's pretty rare. And I think that would be a nice way to go out.
What was it like, obviously, and the difference between putting on the U.S. Hall of Fame ring versus your Olympic rings?
That's an interesting question. The Hall of Fame ring is a culmination of an entire career, and mine was a very long one, especially for a high jumper. I had a 16-year long athletic career. Fortunately for me, it started very early. I was 18 years old, and I retired at 34. And the last 3 years of my career were not particularly stellar from a standpoint of performances. An Olympic team ring is, it's 1 year, it's 1 season, it's 2 track meets, it's the Olympic trials, it's the Olympic Games, and of course, very important, as ours is about the most difficult team to make in the world in most events, certainly in those days. But I think the Hall of Fame ring, which I do wear much more often, is more of a demonstration of an entire body of work. And that's why I was so honored and pleased to be a part of that class. And the other thing that was great about my 1998 induction class, that all 4 of us, none of us were Olympic gold medalists. 3 of us were medalists, but all of us were multiple world record holders. And I thought that was fitting to go in with Jay Sylvester, the late Greg Foster, and Francie LaRue, who was one of my teammates on the Pacific Coast Club. That was very satisfying because we all had the same experiences. Francie made 5 Olympic teams. Greg won a couple silver medals. Jay won silver medals world, but we all had multiple world records. So it was fun going into the Hall of Fame down in Florida with those three.
Throughout your career, what are some of the moment I made it moments for you when you made the Olympics?
Well, I think the two Olympic trials performances, the first one and the last one, are the most memorable. The last one being especially memorable because not only did I win the trials at home, I set an American record, and I pulled my distant cousin, Doug Nordquist, onto the team with me. So we both made the team in the high jump. I just saw him last week at the Dick Fosbury Memorial. And it culminated in really extending my career because of that Sports Illustrated cover shot. It's a pretty strong negotiating tool when you walk into the office of the guy that you've pretty much hit a stone wall with and see the shoe and you on the cover. It was undeniable that I still had a lot of value to the company. So that helped finance my next 3 years of my career and really helped me transition out of the sport and into television and into my life. At that point, my daughter was born, so I had 2 young children. And, the television business is a little bit mercurial. Depending on political regimes changing at any particular network, certain people can be on the outs because the new people want to bring in their own people, sort of like a football coach. When he gets hired, he brings in his own people, so the people that were there are gone. So I was very, very fortunate for the better part of 35 years to navigate through those political ups and downs and end up being on the right side of things when regimes would change, which allowed me to stay at the network that had the Olympics for a very, very long time. I mean, I covered, I think, 10 Olympic Games or 11 Olympic Games for NBC. Over that stretch. So a lot of that was luck and being at the right place at the right time. But I also like to think that's because of the work that, I was the field event guy. I was an island unto myself. It was my domain and I had my statistician. And between the two of us, we all logged some very, very late and very, very long hours doing our event into the wee hours of the morning because of, as I said, time changes when we were in Sydney, when we were in Beijing, when we were in London. Those events took place way before the U.S. time zone. So they were all on tape. People these days with the internet that want to know the outcome, they can know the outcome the moment that it happens. So if they're just married to the outcome and don't need to see how it got there, then they don't need to be watching our coverage. So we were always aware of that and knew that we had to make it as dramatic as we possibly could, even though we were doing it pretty much in the past tense. Got to be pretty good at acting, at voice acting, as though I was speaking about it as it happened, which was very rarely the case.
What has that been like, obviously being a color analyst and a broadcaster and getting to cover these Olympics?
Well, I have to tell you, it's like I think anybody that is in my situation would say the same thing. You're broadcasting the sport that you love, my favorite sport, and getting paid for it. I was able to take my wife to a lot of these Olympic Games, which would have not been something that would have been able for me to do. Took my kids to the Atlanta Olympic Games, which would not have been something I would been able to do had I not been working. So I feel very fortunate that as big a track and field fan as I am and was, more so, I think, than anybody else on those broadcasts, that I was getting paid pretty good money to sit there and watch a great track meet and then apply my expertise and my point of view on to that product, onto what the American people were watching. And my personality has always been, I'm going to say what I feel. I'm going to, if I think a performance is subpar, I'm going to say why. I'm going to say the reasons why. And if I feel an athlete needs to have their feet put to the fire, I'm going to do that because plenty of people put my feet to the fire back in the day. And I stand by what I say. It's very well thought out, especially as I get older. I think about it even more. My parking lot is very, very big between my brain and my mouth before I actually say something. So, I've had athletes come up to me later and tell me, hey, you were a little hard on me. I said, yeah, I was. And let me tell you why. And hopefully in those moments, some wisdom and some experience is imparted that makes that athlete better. So I've always seen that as sort of my job and as my mission. And I'm pretty much a what you see is what you get kind of guy. And that was always my personality on TV. And I don't think that's a small reason why I've been able to endure as long as I have.
What advice would you give those future track and field athletes that are looking to make their first Olympic team?
Well, I will tell you, it's a very, very lofty goal, and you've got to find someone, as I was lucky enough to find. I mean, if my mom decides to buy a home in a different district, I'm not at that. I'm not at Glendale High School, and I'm not coached by John Barnes, 1952 Olympian in the 800 meters. I'm coached by some guy who's an assistant football coach, who probably doesn't know much of anything about my event. So a lot of it has to do with where you are and who it is that coaches you. And I can't stress that enough. Having the right relationship with the person that's guiding you early in the formative years. That's why I love being a high school high jump coach, because hopefully I'm teaching these kids how to do the event correctly in a way where they won't get hurt and where they should be able to improve. Many times I get kids that are so poorly coached by a person who clearly does not know how the event is done, and they create bad habits that are very difficult, if not impossible, to break. And also, when you're a young person, you do not want to take an entire year and take a step backward like that in order to be good next year. Instant gratification is not something that is very well employed in young people these days, for certain. So when you try to tell an athlete, listen, this is going to take the entire season for you to make this change and be better. And in the meantime, you're going to not jump as high as you have before. That's not a proposition that they're very, very anxious to get on board with. So it's difficult. The earlier I can get them, the better, because then I can teach them how to do it correctly. And then when they work, they're working properly. You know, everything about what I did in high school was about technique, refining the technique. I was very physically immature in high school. I didn't get my physical maturity till I got to college and beyond. So I had to be a great technician because I was not fast. I was not strong. I did not know how to drill properly. My coach didn't know that. He was a runner. He wasn't a high jumper. But my technique was flawless, and my technique changed very little from the time I was in high school to the time I retired. I just became stronger and faster, and I was able to get into positions that I could not have gotten in high school, and that's what allowed me to jump higher. But the basic fundamental technique was ingrained very, very early and very, very deeply in my marrow. And that was the key to my success, because I could always go back to the technique. And that's true of any of the jumping and throwing events or hurdling events. You've got to get the technique first. Then you give yourself permission to work hard. And more importantly, work smart. I worked very, very hard, but I did nothing that was extraneous. So though I worked hard at what I did, I worked smart. So I wasn't doing anything that I didn't need to do to be a better high jumper. So there may have been people that outworked me from a standpoint of just pure amount of hours or weight moved or distance run, but so much of it was not productive and not correct and not smart. That's the reason why I beat those people consistently, because they got really, really good at executing the wrong thing. And that's what it is about technique. What they say, practice makes perfect. That's not the correct saying. Practice makes permanent. Only perfect practice makes perfect. And I competed against a lot of people who were really, really, really good at executing the wrong thing. And I encouraged them to continue doing so and keep working hard at that, because then I knew I never had to worry about it.
What advice would you give those Olympians that are looking to transition from being Olympians to retiring and after a life of Olympians?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the agents or the representatives or the managers, whatever you want to call them, are oftentimes not really skilled, I should say, at giving that advice. Ours is still a fledgling professional sport, and I think there's a lot of chicken hawk type agents and managers in the sport taking advantage of the impressionable young people and don't have any clue or maybe even any desire in helping them transition. And let me tell you, the transition is hard. It's very, very difficult, because you normally had an appointment 5 days a week, at least, maybe 6, to show up at the track or show up in the weight room or wherever it might be to do your hour and a half to 2.5 hours, whatever it might be, of training. Suddenly that's not there anymore. That discipline is not there. That time management's not there anymore. And you've got to find another way to make a living. And if you haven't started well before your athletic career is over, it's even more difficult to get your feet underneath you towards something that's productive and can be monetarily rewarding. So any athlete who is not planning for their life after sport is planning to fail. And, or I should say, if they're failing to plan, they're planning to fail. And if they don't have someone to guide them, they need to find someone, because it is a big, big come down from being idolized or cheered, recognized, supported for being an athlete. And when those cheers and applause stop and you're just with yourself and you're unsure about what you're going to do for the rest of your life, that can be daunting and it can be depressing. I was fortunate because I'd already laid the groundwork for a television career, but I then supplemented it with a license in real estate because it allowed me to work during the week at something. And then my wife could take over on the weekends while we raised our kids. And it was a supplemental form of income along with my television, because I knew television could go away at any moment. All it took was the wrong regime to come to power and I could be out, and that could be the end. So fortunately that did not happen, but I was planning for it to happen. And any athlete, as I said, who fails to plan for their life after athletics, which is a life much, much longer than their athletic career, is planning to fail. So take my advice, do something about it today.
What advice would you give those future track and field athletes that are looking to go into the Hall of Fame after their career ends as a track athlete?
I got to tell you, Brandon, there's a lot of athletes out there that have had, that great day, that one great day at the Olympics. Maybe they were not favored to even medal, maybe not even to make the final, and they just, everything falls together and they win a medal or they win a gold medal. But Hall of Fame careers are done over time. They're consistent performance, consistent excellence, consistent ranking high, jumping high, running fast, throwing far, whatever it might be in our sport. And sometimes it has to even be something extra. My something extra was I brought a lot of attention to my sport by doing things that were, for a lot of people, not necessarily things they would do. Let's put it that way. I took the advice pretty much of Muhammad Ali. I did what he did. I remember watching Muhammad Ali as a young man and hating him, just hating him, until I loved him like everyone else did. Maybe the world's greatest athlete, and certainly the most recognizable athlete. And I simply did what he did. I bragged a lot. I predicted what I would do. I would predict who I would beat and how I would beat them. And as long as you are coming through with what you say you're going to do, you're tolerated and you are idolized, adulated. But boy, start not being able to bring it, not being able to perform it, not being able to deliver. That's it. That's the other side of the sword. And for many, many years, I treated my competitors as the warm-up band. That they were just the entertainment, getting ready for me to come on and set a world record or win the meet or whatever it might be. And it served me very, very well. It was not the best thing for the event at the time, but it did inspire a very clear delineation of the crowd for me, the people who loved what I did and the people that hated what I did. And the good news is they all paid the same ticket price. And that's really all I cared about until I was about 23 or 4. And I said, okay, enough of this. You're not the world record holder anymore. You're still one of the best jumpers in the world, still the best jumper in the country. It's time to pivot. So I toned all that down and started focusing on just the performance and getting to know my competitors a little bit better. And now, and not for any reason that I am responsible for, the high jump fraternity is one of the tightest fraternities there is in track and field. Thanks to guys like Hollis Conway and Charles Austin and Mutaz Barshim and Gianmarco Tamberi now. It's a wonderful thing to watch those guys interact with each other during a competition, all of which culminated in Tokyo of them sharing the gold medal, Barshim and Tamberi. It's one of the greatest sportsmanship moments in track and field. It brought a tear to my eye when I was watching it. And I thought it was great. And it was replayed this summer in the women's pole vault at the World Championships. They work so hard. They work so long. It's hot. Competition is lengthy. Athlete is running the risk of perhaps getting hurt, going for something they don't necessarily need to go for. There doesn't only have to be one person winning, they can share it. And since they both agreed to do so, I think that's a wonderful outcome. So somebody asked, he said, well, you wouldn't have done that, would you? I said, name which Olympic Games we're talking about. In my first one, absolutely. I would have said, I'm 18 years old. I've got at least 2 more Olympic Games in me, and I've already got a gold medal. Heck yes. And in my last one, when I knew that I didn't have many more years left, I would have absolutely shared the gold medal. But the one in the middle in Montreal in 1976, not a chance. If I'd been tied for the gold medal in those games and the other athlete came to me and said, hey, let's share this thing, I said, are you kidding me? Get your shoes back on. I'm going to kick your butt. So it's all situational, but I think it's a wonderful thing to see that my sport or my event is one of the strongest fraternities in the sport of track and field. That really warms my heart.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find you at on social media?
I'm at Dwight Stones 78 at Gmail. I'm at Dwight Stones on X, and I'm not terribly active. I'm just of that age. I'm going to be 70 in December. So, and I'm not even sure. Coach Stones is one of my names on Facebook, I believe. My wife manages a lot of that stuff. I'm always available to answer questions from younger people, aspiring high jumpers. I am a coach. I'm an active coach. I love coaching my high school kids, and I've had quite a bit of success. I've had some very, very good jumpers who've gone on to collegiate careers and gotten scholarships, of which I'm very, very proud. Helps relieve the pressure of the family to fund college education for their young people. And I'll do that for as long as I feel I can. Very rarely do I get an opportunity to avail my knowledge of the high jump on a television broadcast just because of the limits of time. So it's not doing me any good inside my head. If I can pass it along and an athlete can improve and excel or become a coach and become a good, strong technical coach, I'm always available for that.
Thank you again, Dwight Stone, for your interview, and best luck in your future as a U.S. Hall of Fame track and field athlete.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks for the opportunity.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Dwight Stone, for your interview, and best luck in your future.
Thank you, Brandon.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.